It was a bright Saturday morning, the kind where the air feels alive, carrying the faint aroma of freshly cut grass and sunshine. People bustled about, lost in their weekend routines, unaware that something extraordinary was about to unfold on their quiet street. Drake Carter, a 30-year-old doctor, was on his way home after a long and exhausting 14-hour shift. His white coat hung neatly on the passenger seat of his old battered sedan, a car that seemed to mirror the wariness of its owner. But despite its appearance, it held memories, miles, and meaning, a reminder of his humble beginnings. Drake was tall, lean, and carried himself with a kind of quiet confidence that turned heads. He wasn't flashy, but he didn't need to be. His work spoke volumes. For Drake, the past night had been a mix of chaos and miracles, saving lives and holding on to hope when it seemed impossible. As he drove down Main Street, his mind drifted, not to the lives he'd saved, but to the simple pleasures waiting for him at home. A warm shower, his bed, and the solace of silence. But fate had other plans. The wail of a police siren pierced through the serenity, jolting him back to reality. Drake sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. His heart didn't race. He wasn't nervous. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped for no apparent reason, and deep down he knew it wouldn't be the last. Still, he kept his face calm, his hands visible, and his thoughts steady. Two officers emerged from the patrol car. The first, a burly, blond giant with a smirk that screamed authority and amusement, approached with a swagger. His name tag read Travis. The second officer, lanky and wiry, with a grin that felt more like a sneer, circled to the passenger side. He was Jimmy, and together they seemed like a duo straight out of a buddy cop movie, except there was nothing funny about their routine. "Tail lights out, buddy," Travis drawled, leaning against the car door like he owned it. His voice carried a tone of mock concern, the kind that hinted this wasn't about safety. Drake handed over his license and registration without a word. His face remained unreadable, a mask perfected over years of encountering situations just like this. Jimmy wasn't satisfied with the silence. "What's the matter?" "Cat got your tongue?" he asked, his grin widening. "Or are you just trying to think up a good excuse?" Drake turned his head slightly. "Just came off a shift." "I'm a doctor," he said simply, his voice even and calm. For a moment, there was silence. Then Travis snorted, gesturing at Drake's car. "A doctor driving this? Shouldn't you be in one of those fancy SUVs, or, I don't know, something that doesn't look like it's on life support?" Jimmy chuckled, adding his 2 cents. "Yeah, or maybe a car that doesn't look like it belongs in a junkyard." Drake didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, and he knew better than to react. But the officers weren't done. Travis stepped back, folding his arms. "So, Doc, what kind of medicine are we talking about here? Back alley operations? Or are you one of those celebrity TV doctors?" "Maybe he's prescribing meds in baggies," Ginny quipped, his grin never fading. Drake's patience, though tested, held firm. "I'm just trying to get home," he said, keeping his voice steady. But Travis had already made up his mind. "Step out of the car for us, Doc," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Just a routine check. Drake obliged, moving slowly and deliberately, careful not to give them any excuse. Still, it wasn't enough. As soon as he stepped out, Travis grabbed his arms and snapped on the handcuffs. The cold nephil bit into Drake's wrists, but he kept his composure. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Phones were out, recording the spectacle as whispers of disbelief spread among the onlookers. Travis, basking in the attention, turned to the crowd with a theatrical wave. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet the doctor who makes house calls on the sidewalk. Guess healthcare is going mobile these days." Jimmy laughed, nudging Drake with his boot. "Yeah, or maybe he's starting a new trend, Street MD. What do you think, Doc?" "Put a ring to it." Drake didn't respond. He sat silently on the curb, his white coat now a stark contrast to the pavement, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He wasn't just enduring their mockery. He was refusing to give it power. But the crowd wasn't laughing. The murmurs grew louder, the recording phones became more persistent, and the officer's jokes began to falter under the weight of public scrutiny. Still, Drake remained silent, because he knew that sometimes silence could speak louder than words. Inside the precinct, chaos reigned. Phones rang incessantly, voices shouted over one another, and the smell of burnt coffee filled the air. Drake was led through the disorder, his cuffs digging into his wrists as officers cast curious glances his way. He was shoved into a small, dimly lit interrogation room, the walls yellowed with age and neglect. Travis and Jimmy entered, their bravado intact, though it carried a slight edge of unease. Travis dragged a chair across the floor, the sound grating, before plopping down in front of Drake. "Let's talk about that fancy coat of yours," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Where'd you get it?" "The Halloween store." Jimmy leaned against the wall, arms crossed, grinning. "Or maybe it's one of those costumes with a fake stethoscope. Pretty convincing, though." Drake leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "I'd like to speak to a lawyer," he said, his voice steady. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Jimmy laughed, though it sounded forced. "A lawyer? Really? You're acting like you didn't just get caught looking real suspicious." Travis leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Here's the deal, Doc. You cooperate, and maybe we don't have to dig too deep. Just tell us what you were really doing out there, middle of the morning, in that car." Drake's gaze didn't waver. "I was driving home from work. I'm a physician, and unless you have real charges, I'd like to make that phone call now." Travis scowled, turning to a laptop in the corner of the room. "Let's see what the system has to say about you," he muttered, typing furiously. Jimmy, meanwhile, continued pacing the room, cracking jokes that fell flat in the growing tension. But then something shifted. Travis froze, his eyes fixed on the screen. His posture stiffened, and the bravado drained from his face. He leaned closer, rereading the text as if it couldn't possibly be real. "Jimmy," Travis said, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. "Step out for a minute." Jimmy frowned, his grin faltering. "What? Why? What'd you find?" "Just go," Travis barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jimmy hesitated, but eventually shrugged and left, muttering under his breath. Now it was just Travis and Drake. The air in the room felt heavier, the tension thick enough to cut. Slowly, Travis turned the laptop screen toward Drake. The photos and records displayed on the screen revealed a truth that shattered Travis' assumptions, and threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew. In that moment, the world outside the interrogation room seemed to fade away, leaving only the weight of a truth too profound to ignore. Travis stared at the laptop, his face drained of the bravado he had worn like a second skin. The screen illuminated records that didn't just confirm Drake's story, they elevated it beyond anything the officer could have anticipated. The names and faces on the screen weren't just anonymous patients. They were people Travis and Jimmy knew personally, intimately. One of those names belonged to Travis' own mother, the woman he had spent sleepless nights praying for when she was admitted for a critical heart condition 6 months ago. She was in surgery for hours, Travis murmured, almost to himself, his eyes still glued to the screen. His mind raced back to that terrifying night, the helplessness that had consumed him as he sat in the hospital waiting room, pacing the cold tiles, hoping for a miracle. "And you," he trailed off, his voice caught between disbelief and guilt. Drake sat still, his posture calm but deliberate. His face betrayed no anger, no satisfaction, just the kind of steady patience that came from years of holding steady in chaotic situations. "I was one of the surgeons that night," he said finally, his voice as measured as his gaze. "She was in critical condition, but we managed to stabilize her." The weight of those words hit Travis like a punch to the gut. The memory of his mother sitting at the dining table a few days later, alive and smiling weakly, came flooding back. How could the same man he had humiliated, handcuffed, and mocked be the one responsible for saving her life? The door creaked open, breaking the silence. Jimmy stepped back in, his smug grin returning, as if he hadn't noticed the shift in the room. "So, What's the big secret, huh? Did our doctor win a Nobel Prize or something? He chuckled, but the laughter died in his throat when he saw Travis' expression. You need to see this, Travis said quietly, turning the laptop toward Jimmy. Jimmy walked over, his brows furrowing as he leaned in to read the screen. The grin vanished completely, replaced by a look of confusion, and then something closer to shame. His face went pale when his eyes landed on the picture of his own father, taken during an emergency surgery just a few months ago. What the hell? Jimmy's voice cracked as he straightened up. He looked at Drake, then back at Travis. You're saying asterisk, he asterisk. Drake's calm gaze shifted to Jimmy. Your father had a ruptured artery. It was a complicated procedure, but we were able to stop the bleeding in time. Jimmy took a step back, his hand running through his hair as he tried to process the revelation. The mocking confidence he had carried all morning was gone, replaced by a quiet, hollow confusion. For a long moment, the room was silent. Travis sat back in his chair, his hands resting heavily on the table as he avoided Drake's gaze. Jimmy leaned against the wall, staring at the floor like it might offer some kind of explanation. Drake, still standing, adjusted the cuffs digging into his wrists. His voice cut through the silence, even and calm. I don't expect you to thank me. I'm not here to make you feel small. Maybe you'll think twice the next time you decide to humiliate someone for your own amusement. Neither Travis nor Jimmy responded. The weight of their actions was pressing down on them now, more suffocating than the laughter of the crowd outside or the recording phones capturing every moment. But the story didn't end there. The precinct was abuzz with whispers. Word about what had happened in the interrogation room had started to spread, and officers were passing glances, some curious, others uneasy. Outside, the crowd had grown. People were demanding answers, their voices rising with a collective sense of indignation. Drake sat back in the interrogation room, waiting as Travis and Jimmy excused themselves to sort things out. You could hear their muffled voices outside the door, a sharp edge of panic in their tones as they argued over what to do next. For Drake, this wasn't new. He had faced countless moments where his integrity and patience had been tested, where he had been judged not for his achievements, but for the color of his skin or the car he drove. But today, the weight of it all felt heavier. Maybe it was the long shift that had left him drained, or maybe it was the crowd outside, their faces a mixture of anger and hope. The door opened, and an older officer with graying hair and a weary expression stepped in. He looked at Drake, his gaze steady but not unkind. Dr. Carter, he began, his voice softer than the others. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Drake raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The officer sighed, his shoulders sagging. You're free to go. We've cleared everything up. Drake stood slowly, his posture as calm as ever, even as the cuffs were unlocked. He rubbed his wrists, but his gaze never left the older man's face. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his tone carrying just enough weight to make the officer wince. Yes, well, the officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I'll handle the situation internally. You won't be bothered again. Drake didn't respond. He simply picked up his white coat, draping it over his arm as he walked toward the door. Outside, the crowd parted as he stepped onto the precinct steps. Phones were raised, their cameras capturing every moment as murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some called out words of support, others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. Drake paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He could see the questions in their eyes, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. But he didn't linger. He descended the steps, his movements deliberate and composed, until he reached the street. As he walked toward his car, he heard someone shout, "What happens now, Doc?" Drake stopped, turning slightly. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but then he simply shook his head and continued walking. In the days that followed, the incident made headlines. Clips of the officers' mocking comments and the revelation of Drake's identity went viral, sparking outrage and conversations about accountability. Some called for the officers to be fired, while others used the story as a rallying cry for change. Drake, however, stayed quiet. he returned to his work, focusing on the patients who needed him, the people who saw him not as a headline but as a healer. But the weight of that morning lingered, not just for Drake, but for Travis and Jimmy, whose lives had been upended in ways they hadn't anticipated. The choices they made next would determine whether this was just another story or the beginning of something more profound. The tension remained unresolved and heavy as the world continued watching, waiting for what would happen next. The precinct buzzed long after Drake Carter had walked out the door. Travis and Jimmy sat in the break room, an awkward silence stretching between them. Neither touched the steaming mugs of coffee in front of them, both staring at the table as though it held the answers they desperately needed. The air felt heavy, laden with guilt and something neither was ready to name: shame. Travis leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You saw those files," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "I didn't even recognize him. How does someone like that, someone who saves lives, end up in cuffs because of us?" Jimmy didn't answer immediately. He picked at the corner of his coffee cup, his usual swagger replaced by an uneasy stillness. "We weren't exactly looking for reasons to recognize him," he admitted finally. The words felt bitter in his mouth, but they were the truth. They hadn't seen Drake as a doctor or even as a person. He was just another face to them, another target for their routine. Outside the precinct, the protests had grown louder. People from the community had gathered, holding signs demanding accountability. News vans lined the street, their cameras capturing every chant, every raised fist. It wasn't just about Drake anymore. His story had become a symbol, a flashpoint for years of tension simmering beneath the surface. In the hospital, Drake moved through his shift with his usual quiet focus. But the stares followed him. Nurses whispered in the hallways, and patients watched him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The story had spread like wildfire, and now everyone seemed to know who he was, the doctor who had been humiliated for doing nothing wrong. Dr. Carter, one of the younger nurses, called as he checked a patient's chart. She looked nervous, twisting the hem of her scrubs as she approached him. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened." Drake looked up from the chart, his expression softening. "It's not your fault," he said gently. "But it's not fair," she insisted, her voice trembling. "You don't deserve that." "No one does." Drake nodded, his gaze steady but distant. "Fairness doesn't always come into play," he replied, "but we keep moving forward. That's what matters." As the days passed, the tension outside the precinct seeped into its walls. Officers whispered in corners, their eyes darting to Travis and Jimmy whenever they entered a room. Some of the senior staff avoided them altogether, unwilling to engage in the fallout of their actions. Travis found himself in the captain's office more than once, the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. The captain, a grizzled man with decades on the force, leaned back in his chair and fixed Travis with a hard stare. "You've got a choice to make," he said bluntly. "You can bury your head in the sand and hope this blows over, or you can face it head on. But don't think for a second that this will just go away. People are watching." Travis left the office feeling smaller than he ever had before. He knew the captain was right, but what could he possibly do to make amends? Jimmy, meanwhile, was grappling with his own demons. He couldn't shake the image of his father's face, pale and vulnerable, lying on that hospital bed months ago. He remembered the relief when the doctors had told him the surgery was a success. Now, knowing that Drake had been the one to save him, Jimmy felt a hollowness in his chest that no amount of bravado could fill. One evening, long after the precinct had emptied out, Jimmy found himself scrolling through social media. The videos of him and Travis mocking Drake were everywhere, paired with hashtags demanding justice. He clicked on one post, a clip of Drake walking out of the precinct, his coat slung over his arm. The caption read, "Asterisk Grace under fire. How many more will it take before something changes asterisk?" Jimmy stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the comments section. The anger and outrage in the comments were palpable, but what struck him most were the personal stories people shared. Stories of humiliation, fear, and injustice. Stories that mirrored what Drake had endured. The next morning, Jimmy approached Travis as he sat in the break room. "We've got to do something," he said, his voice firm, despite the uncertainty in his eyes. Travis looked up, his expression guarded. "Like what? Apologize and hope it fixes everything? That's not how this works." "No," Jimmy admitted, sitting down across from him. "But we can't just pretend like it didn't happen. We messed up. Big time. And now, everyone knows it." Travis rubbed his temples, the frustration evident in his posture. "You think I don't know that? You think I'm not kicking myself every second for how we treated him? Then let's stop kicking ourselves and do something about it," Jimmy pressed. "I don't know what yet, but we can't just sit here." Across town, Drake sat at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea as he scrolled through his phone. The messages and comments were overwhelming. Some were supportive, others were hateful, but most were from people sharing their own stories. As much as he wanted to turn it off, to step away from the noise, he couldn't ignore the voices. His phone buzzed with a call. It was from a hospital's PR department. He hesitated before answering, bracing himself for whatever they had to say. "Dr. Carter," the voice on the other end said, warm but businesslike. "We've been getting a lot of media requests about your story. I wanted to check in with you before we respond." Drake sighed, running a hand over his face. "I appreciate the concern," he said carefully, "but I'm not interested in turning this into a spectacle. My focus is on my patients." "Of course," the PR representative replied. "But if you ever change your mind, know that we're here to support you." Drake thanked them and ended the call, setting his phone down on the table. He stared out the window, the weight of the past few days settling over him like a heavy blanket. The world outside was changing, but for Drake, the question remained, was it enough? Or would this be just another story, forgotten as soon as the next headline broke? The days turned into a blur as the story grew beyond anyone's expectations. Drake went about his life as best as he could, trying to focus on his work, but the weight of everything hung over him. Every shift at the hospital brought sidelong glances and quiet murmurs from colleagues. Patients looked at him differently now, not just as a doctor, but as the man they'd seen on the news, standing tall in the face of blatant disrespect. Despite his calm demeanor, the strain was undeniable. It wasn't the media attention or even the viral videos that got to him. It was the principle, the way his dignity had been stripped away so casually, the way his accomplishments had been overlooked in an instant. The community, however, refused to let it go. Outside the precinct, the protests swelled. What had started as a small crowd had turned into a full-blown movement. Local activists organized rallies, speakers shared their experiences, and the energy in the air was electric. Signs waved in the breeze, bearing messages of justice, equality, and accountability. Inside the precinct, tension crackled like static. The officers couldn't ignore what was happening right outside their doors. The walls seemed thinner with every chant, every demand for change. Travis and Jimmy felt it the most. Their colleagues avoided them, some openly critical of their actions, others just uncomfortable in their presence. Travis tried to brush it off, telling himself he faced tough situations before. But this was different. He couldn't shake the memory of Drake's calm, steady gaze in the interrogation room, or the way the crowd had turned on them outside. For the first time in a long time, he felt exposed, not as a cop, but as a flawed human being. Jimmy, on the other hand, had stopped pretending he wasn't affected. The bravado that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet unease. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over, the smug grin on his face, the casual cruelty of his words, and then the stark realization that the man they humiliated had saved his father's life. Late one evening, Jimmy found himself parked outside his father's house. He hadn't planned to visit, but his guilt had driven him there. Sitting in his car, he stared at the house, the porch light casting a warm glow against the night. When he finally mustered the courage to knock, his father answered, his face lighting up with surprise. "Jimmy, what brings you here so late?" Jimmy hesitated, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I had just wanted to check on you," he said awkwardly. His father laughed, stepping aside to let him in. "You're not usually the checking-in type, but I'll take it. Come on in." As they sat in the living room, Jimmy struggled to find the words. The television played softly in the background, the news still covering the fallout of the precinct incident. His father didn't say anything about it, but Jimmy could feel the unspoken tension hanging between them. "Dad," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "Do you remember the doctor who treated you, the one who did the surgery?" His father's expression softened. "Of course I remember. Dr. Carter. He's the reason I'm sitting here talking to you right now." "Why?" Jimmy swallowed hard, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I didn't know it was him. The other day, at the precinct, we treated him like garbage. And now everyone knows. I don't know how to fix it." His father leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jimmy. "You can't undo what's already done, son. But you can decide what kind of man you want to be moving forward." The words hit Jimmy harder than he expected. He nodded silently, the guilt simmering beneath the surface. Back at the hospital, Drake found himself drawn into the whirlwind of media attention despite his best efforts to avoid it. Patients thanked him not only for his medical care, but for his strength in standing up to injustice. Reporters reached out, eager for an interview, but he declined them all. One evening, as he finished his shift, he noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. It was Travis, standing awkwardly by the doors, his hands in his pockets. Drake hesitated for a moment before approaching him. "Officer Travis," he said, his tone even. "What brings you here?" Travis looked up, his face pale and uncertain. "I wanted to talk to you," he said. "About what happened." Drake studied him carefully, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening." Travis shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "What we did was wrong," he admitted. "There's no excuse for it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Drake nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Acknowledging it is a start," he said. "But words are easy. It's actions that matter." The tension between them was palpable, but Travis felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make things right. As the night wore on, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The protests outside the precinct grew louder, the community refusing to back down. Inside, Travis and Jimmy wrestled with their guilt, knowing they couldn't escape the consequences of their actions. And Drake, despite everything, carried on. Because for him, this wasn't just about one incident. It was about something bigger, about standing tall in the face of injustice and refusing to let it define him. The city was still buzzing, a mix of anger, curiosity, and impatience swirling in the air. Every update about Drake, the officers, and the ongoing protests seemed to ignite another round of discussions online and in the streets. But just as the momentum seemed to be building towards something inevitable, a new detail surfaced that sent shockwaves through the growing movement. It began with a simple post on social media, an image of a document that no one expected to see. The caption read, "**, there's more to this story than they're letting on. Follow the paper trail." Within hours, the post had gone viral. The document appeared to be an internal memo from the precinct, dated weeks before the incident with Drake, outlining concerns about the conduct of certain officers, specifically mentioning Travis and Jimmy. The memo detailed a pattern of behavior, escalated complaints from civilians, excessive force during routine stops, and a tendency to single out specific communities. The memo recommended immediate intervention, yet nothing had been done. It painted a picture of negligence, of a system that allowed Travis and Jimmy to continue unchecked. As the document made its rounds, so did a video clip, one that no one could have anticipated. The footage, grainy and shot from a distance, appeared to show Travis and Jimmy in a heated argument outside the precinct parking lot a few days before their encounter with Drake. The audio was faint, but a few words stood out clearly. "*It's gonna catch up to us. **. The video and memo added fuel to an already blazing fire. People began asking questions, not just about the incident with Drake, but about the entire culture within the precinct. Activists called for a deeper investigation, demanding to know why warning signs had been ignored. Drake watched the fallout unfold with mixed emotions. He hadn't wanted this level of exposure. He hadn't asked to become the face of a larger movement. But as he saw the stories and experiences shared by others, people who had suffered similar indignities but hadn't had a platform to speak, he realized this was bigger than him. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about a system that needed to change. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the atmosphere was suffocating. Travis and Jimmy found themselves under a microscope, their every move scrutinized. The release of the memo and the video had shifted the focus away from Drake's arrest to the officer's troubling history. Even their colleagues, many of whom had turned a blind eye to their behavior for years, were starting to distance themselves. Jimmy, already struggling with guilt, was unraveling. The mounting pressure made him jumpy, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. Travis, however, was harder to read. He seemed determined to maintain his composure, but there was a new intensity in his eyes, a quiet desperation. Late one night, Travis found himself sitting alone in the precinct's break room, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The voices outside, protesters chanting, demanding accountability, were louder than ever. His mind replayed the moment he'd seen the memo surface online, the way his stomach had dropped when he realized the world now knew what he'd been trying to bury. He didn't hear the door open behind him until Jimmy spoke. "You think this ends with us?" Jimmy's voice was low, almost a whisper. He leaned against the doorframe, his face pale. "You think they're not going to start digging into everyone? This whole place is under fire now." Travis didn't answer first. He took a long breath, his eyes never leaving the reflection. "They're going to dig," he said finally, "and they're going to find things. But that doesn't mean we give them more to work with." Jimmy frowned, his confusion evident. "What are you talking about?" Travis turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "We stick together. No matter what. If they're looking for someone to blame, we make sure it's not us." Jimmy's unease deepened. "You think we can just... what? Pretend none of this happened? That memo, that video, they're not going away, Travis." Travis's jaw tightened. "Then we control the narrative. We make them question it, discredit it if we have to. You want your career to survive this, don't you?" Jimmy hesitated, the weight of Travis's words sinking in. But before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both men tensed as the door opened, revealing their captain. The captain's expression was grim, his voice heavy with authority. "Both of you, my office. Now." As Travis and Jimmy followed him down the hallway, their minds raced. The air felt colder, the walls closing in with each step. They couldn't tell if they were being called in for damage control, or if this was the beginning of the end. Drake, meanwhile, was facing his own crossroads. Despite his reluctance to speak publicly, the calls for him to take a stand were growing louder. Community leaders reached out, asking him to address the protests and use his voice to push for change. His colleagues at the hospital urged him to share his story, believing it could make a real difference. But Drake wasn't sure. He'd spent his life letting his actions speak for him, choosing to fight his battles quietly. Now, though, the stakes were different. The world was watching, and people were counting on him. As he stood in his apartment, staring at the stack of messages and interview requests on his table, his phone buzzed with a new notification. It was a text from someone he hadn't expected. A reporter who claimed to have information that would change everything. Drake hesitated before opening the message. The reporter's words were simple, but loaded with implications. Asterisk, there's something you need to see. It's about Travis and Jimmy, and it's worse than you think. Asterisk. The story was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever, the truth more complicated than anyone realized. And as the city braced for what was coming, one thing was clear. The climax was just around the corner. The precinct was unnaturally quiet. Even the protesters outside seemed to have paused for breath, their chants replaced by the distant hum of traffic. Inside the captain's office, Travis and Jimmy sat across from their superior, who paced the room with a worn expression. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching painfully as the captain seemed to weigh his next words carefully. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to them, his voice low and measured. The department is under scrutiny like never before. Every move you've made is being dissected, every choice questioned. I need to know, was there anything about your encounter with Dr. Carter that hasn't been reported? Travis and Jimmy exchanged a glance. Travis was the first to respond, his tone clipped but steady. Everything we did is on record, sir. We'd followed procedure. The captain's eyes narrowed. Procedure. Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a lot more like harassment. He slammed a file onto the desk, the sound echoing in the small room. Do you even realize what you've done? You didn't just detain a doctor. You detained someone with a spotless record. Someone who saved lives, including people you know. Jimmy flinched, guilt flickering across his face, but Travis remained composed. With all due respect, sir, we didn't know who he was at the time. And that's supposed to make it better. The captain's voice rose, his frustration spilling over. The public doesn't care what you knew or didn't know. They care that this happened at all. And now, with that memo and the video making the rounds, they're questioning whether this entire department is rotten. Before Travis could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. The captain barked in order to enter, and the young officer stepped in, his expression a mix of urgency and hesitation. Sir, there's someone here to see you. It's Dr. Carter. The room fell silent. Jimmy's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Even Travis, usually unshakable, seemed momentarily caught off guard. The captain nodded grimly. Sent him in. When Drake entered, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence as before, but there was an edge to him now, a determination that filled the room. He was dressed sharply, his white coat conspicuously absent, and he held a folder in one hand. He didn't sit, instead choosing to stand tall, his gaze sweeping over the three men in front of him. I thought it was time we talked, Drake said, his voice calm but firm. There are things you need to know, things the public deserves to know. The captain gestured for him to continue, and Drake opened the folder, pulling out several documents. I received these earlier today from a journalist who's been investigating this department. It's a pattern of complaints, incidents swept under the rug, and a lack of accountability that goes beyond just these two officers. Travis's jaw tightened, and Jimmy looked like he wanted to melt into his chair. The captain took the documents and began skimming them, his frown deepening with each page. But there's more, Drake continued, his gaze locking onto Travis and Jimmy. The journalist also found financial records, payments made to an account linked to you, Officer Travis. Payments from someone connected to a lawsuit against this department. The room froze. Travis's face drained of color, his usual composure slipping for the first time. That's a lie, he said quickly, his voice rising. I don't know what you're talking about. Drake didn't flinch. The evidence says otherwise, and it raises questions about whether your actions were motivated by more than just bias. Jimmy turned to Travis, confusion and betrayal written all over his face. What is he talking about, Travis? What payments? Travis shot him a glare. Don't listen to this. It's a setup. But the captain wasn't buying it. He slammed the documents onto the desk. Enough. I've seen enough. Officer Travis, you're suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. And you, Officer Jimmy, you're not off the hook either. Jimmy's mouth opened as if to protest, but he closed it again, his shoulders slumping. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to crush down on him at once. Drake turned to leave, but before he reached the door he paused. This isn't just about me, he said without turning around. It's about everyone who's being treated like their dignity doesn't matter. You all have a chance to do better. I hope you take it. He walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. Outside, the protesters were still gathered, their voices rising again as they spotted him. But this time, Drake didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt a sense of clarity, a determination to see this through. As the captain began making calls to higher-ups and the department scrambled to contain the fallout, Drake stepped into the cool evening air. The story wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like change was possible. What no one realized, though, was that the journalist had one more piece of information, something even Drake didn't know yet. A connection between Trevor's payments and a figure much higher up in the department, someone who had been pulling strings all along. The truth, it seemed, was still unraveling. And as Drake walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he had ever anticipated.